So we're a collective of people. We call ourselves Seeing the Strings, and we've been organizing these teach-ins as a way of talking about how does capitalism affect our lives, and by understanding how it affects our lives, how can we lessen its ability to impact our lives negatively, and how can we respond against it, and to be able to respond effectively to limit its capacity to control our lives. We have to understand how it functions and how it works in our lives. And so this session is Capitalism and Ecology, and myself personally, I'm interested in talking about the way that capitalism functions kind of as a system of understanding the world, and a system of understanding the world that's not consistent with functioning ecologies, and that we need to understand ecologies differently and outside of a capitalist understanding, which is an understanding of separation, because ecologies only function when they're whole integrated units, and we only function because we're animals when our ecologies are whole integrated units, and capitalism makes that impossible. So the way of understanding ecologies and nature that supports capitalism is a way of understanding nature that doesn't actually reflect ecology, and it doesn't serve us. And so we need a different way of understanding ecology that allows us to imagine a way out of capitalism for our survival and for the survival of other species that we share this planet with. Great. So the first one that I want to talk about broadly is that this idea of nature as opposed to ecology is something that is constructed by humans and is something that allows us to kind of define it relative to ourselves, right? We don't really define nature as a thing in and of itself. We define it as its absence of us, right? A wild place is a place that has no people in it, right? Something that's natural, you know, it's just left natural, right? People haven't gone in and done anything to it. So it creates this idea that something's natural if it has no people. Notwithstanding the fact that there are ecologies inside of us and that we participate with our ecologies. So it lends itself really well to this idea of separation, which lends itself really well to an ontology and an epistemology that works really well for capitalism, right? So the second problem that I see with this idea of nature is that the way that it's constructed, the historical process of its construction, is really interesting. You can look at Western Europe in the sort of 1500s to 1700s, and I'm drawing on the work now of someone called Carolyn Merchant, if anyone has read The Death of Nature. She did a historical survey of the change from a European worldview that saw nature as whole, organic, alive, making itself, participating in processes with the people that live with it, to a way of looking at nature that sees it as dead, as mechanical, as passive, as something that doesn't do anything until humans do something with it, right? So the shift from a living, active nature to a dead, passive nature is something that you can trace historically. You can see the path from one European philosopher to another, you know, attacking this, what was previously the dominant European view of nature as something that's organic and alive, that participates, that provides abundance for people and all the other animals and the trees, and that's all linked together and of which we are a part. And a specific philosophical project to dismantle that way of looking at nature and construct one that sees nature as being a machine, being passive, right? So it's a shift from a participating and abundant nature to a passive and scarce nature. And of course, capitalism requires scarcity in order to function also, right? Because if my jar, going back to the jar, as well as having its clear boundaries so that I can control it and say you have to pay me to drink water out of it, you know, as well as having those clear boundaries, it also has to be scarce. If everybody has a jar of water, nobody's going to pay me, right? So I don't only have to have this jar of water, I have to have all the jars of water, right? So if you don't have all the jars of water, capitalist economists call this opportunity cost, right? If there's something that you could make money off of, if you could commodify it, but you're not doing that, then that's a cost. That's an opportunity to make money that you're not taking advantage of, right? We also call that colonization, right? We also call that entitlement. We also call that lots of other things. But one word for it is opportunity cost, right? So this shift from a living, participating, abundant nature to a dead, passive, scarce nature that only provides for us through the wonderful ingenuity of humans that can run machines, leads to what I see as being the third problem with this idea of nature. And so what it does is, by creating this separation between people and nature, it then becomes really easy to say, well, and actually, now that we're at it, there's all these other people that we can make part of nature. So because nature as a concept has always been identified as female in European culture, you look at European languages, it's always been a female word and all that stuff. You can see that the rise of a passive dead nature that's there to just provide for people without having any agency of its own is also historically contemporaneous with a huge decline in women's power in European societies, right? It's contemporaneous with the rise of witch burning, right? Women that formerly were healers, that were midwives, that were doctors, that knew about herbs, that knew how to heal within their communities, all of a sudden are being burned at the stake to the level that there were some communities that had no female citizens left under the age of 80 in some parts of Western Europe in around the 1600s, at least according to texts that we have, and who knows what really happened, but anyway. And so then, also contemporaneous to this are the European capitalist powers starting to realize that they were running out of resources, right? So this is also contemporaneous to, the lifting of what formerly had been cultural sanctions on things like mining and stripping forests to make charcoal, to run furnaces to do metallurgy. All of the things that capitalism needed in order to function, mines, trees, natural resources. Europe started running out of those things, right? We see the loss of swamp ecosystems all across what's now the UK as they started making windmills to pump the water out and turn the swamps into fields that they could raise sheep, because all of a sudden the industrial production of wool and cloth was possible, and this was making capitalists really, really rich, and they wanted more and more land for more and more sheep. Never mind that there were people on that land. Who cares about them? They can work in the factory. So then this idea of a passive nature into which you can then put other classes of people gets transported to Turtle Island when Europe starts to realize that it's running out of resources. But hey, there's this whole place over here that we can come and take resources from. Opportunity cost, right? If we don't do this, that is going to constrain the capacity of European capitalism to expand and create more wealth for capitalists, right? So the reason that all of this matters is that it comes back around to realizing that a shift in how we view nature, a shift from what I would argue is a more ecological view of reciprocity and connection and understanding that all these things relate to each other. The shift from that to a disconnected, separate view of nature is historically contemporaneous with the rise of capitalism. It's historically contemporaneous with the rise of much tighter control of women's rights. It's contemporaneous with the rise of colonialism and the genocide against indigenous peoples around the world. And so we see that the way that we think about nature or ecology or the world that we live with affects how we live in the world, because we're animals, right? Whether we like it or not, we're connected to this ecology, and the relationship that we have with it shapes all the other relationships that we have, right? And so capitalism can't function without destroying ecology, because it has to separate things in order to function. And ecologies don't function if their parts are separated, right? If you come in and cut down all the trees, a forest ecology no longer functions. And if you plant them up again with genetically identical cell cultures of lodgepole pine that don't belong in that place, and you remove all of the underbrush with herbicides, that ecology still doesn't function because you've separated out the trees. These trees are the commodity. We want the trees. So we'll just put those trees in and get rid of everything else. That ecology ceases to function when you do that, right? So capitalism cannot function without separating things. And ecologies can't function if things are separated, right? They're incompatible with one another. And of course, our life, because we're animals, is incompatible with the destruction of ecologies. So the other thing about the rise of this way of looking at ecology that allowed for capitalism to grow is that it's also the story of people's resistance to the rise of that way of looking at the world. It's the story of people's resistance to capitalism. It's the story of people fighting to keep their traditional healers, to keep their ways of living, to keep access to the land that they lived on without having to participate in the wage economy. And the reason I say that is because we need to know that we're not the first ones to fight this fight. Because this is the story of people fighting against this. What this teaches us is that in every place, in every ecology, people have different relationships to their ecology, and they're all going to fight to keep that if they can, and that's all going to look different in different places, through different people. And so what we can take from all of this is that we have the capacity to fight where we stand. But what we need in order to do that is a way of knowing and a way of understanding the world that shows us that there is another way. So if we allow capitalism to control the way we look at ecology, then how can we ever figure out a way to make a space that is non-capitalist if the capitalist way of looking at the world is the only one that we know? So this is why ecology matters, because it shows us how to imagine another place. And once we imagine it, then we can set about the work of going there. So that was very broad. And the how, some of the hows, some of the things that people are doing to fight those fights, where they are in different ways, represented by these lovely people on my right. And I think Eric is going to speak next, right?
Oh, am I? Okay.
Are you? Is that okay?
That's all right. Okay.
Okay. Thank you all for your attention.
Okay, I'm Erin Innes, and I'm a transportation planner and writer. I'm going to tell a much simpler story and actually starting in much more recent times about capitalism, because capitalism actually got a new definition after the Great Depression. After the Great Depression and World War II, the capitalist economists actually took a look at what had been the sort of the features of capitalism, and one of the key ones that was a feature of capitalism was new was the need for growth. But early capitalist economists thought that the need for the economy to grow was a transient thing. It was temporary. Capitalist economy was going to grow for a certain number of years, a certain amount of time, and then it was going to have to plateau as you ran out of resources or room. And at those early times, they were mainly thinking about, well, we're just going to run out of agricultural land. Forests, things like land and forest. Even early capitalist economists knew that there were limits to the natural world and how much impacts you could put on it, how much resources you could draw out of it. So, but what happened in the Great Depression was that economies stopped growing, and people, ordinary people, 99%, got really organized in a whole bunch of different ways and started demanding more equal distribution of wealth. They said, there is enough for everybody. Let's distribute it more equally. And they were particularly angry because they'd come through the 1920s, a period of massive economic growth, very much like the 1980s and 1990s, where the size of the economies around the world, the capitalist economy, had grown immensely quickly, very, very quickly. Automation was a huge story. Factories became more and more efficient. But there wasn't actually much benefit that filtered down to the ordinary working people. It was very much a time of concentration of wealth in the 1%. And even the top 10% of the 1%. The very, very wealthy. And what happened, though, was like after the World War II, which was the restarting, and during World War II, capitalist economies grew like topsy, but almost totally based on government spending on war. And afterwards, particularly in the US and Canada, capitalist economists just decided that rather than partly to forestall this demand for redistribution, they decided that infinite growth was possible, desirable, and necessary. And in order to keep the economy growing, they decided that they needed to create consumer capitalism, what I like to call consumer capitalism. Because that's what it's about. It's not this idea. It's not some abstract idea. It's about people always wanting more crap and always consuming more crap. And the biggest thing that was done to do these kind of three elements. There was advertising to create wants. Modern advertising really came into being right after World War II. It already been starting well before that, but it really came blue. Consumer credit. And the first big-time consumer credit was for automobiles. So the automobile, advertising, consumer credit, those three elements came together with the government infrastructure spending to make it work. Highway expansion, roadway expansion. And the interstate highway system in the United States was the biggest public works program ever. We've never seen anything like it since. Before or since. Bigger than the Great Wall of China in the scale of the economy at the time. So actually after World War II, what capitalism was reinvented. The whole idea of the good life was reinvented. And at this time, if I'm talking and I have a PowerPoint presentation, I show a lovely picture of the mid-50s car with great big fins. Planned obsolescence was developed, and the fins on these cars would change every year, so that you'd know if your car was 3 years old, you'd know that you were inadequate and should no longer be really happy with your car. Kind of like your iPhone these days. You should no longer be happy with your 3-year-old iPhone because it's not the latest version. And it worked really well. The oil industry, the steel industry, the auto industry. The auto industry became the largest manufacturing sector by far, and it became the largest consumer for every industrial product. And all of this just kept chugging along just fine until we get to sort of where we are today, where at the beginning of this story, during World War II and after World War II, 1950s, the United States was the world's largest oil exporter. Now they're the world's largest oil importer, or maybe China has overtaken in the last couple of years. But more importantly, we're just coming to the obvious, really obvious limits of growth. And Rin was talking a lot about the deeper understanding of the need to really grasp human connections to nature and nature connections. But when you pump so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that the oceans right here become acidic to the point that oysters can no longer reproduce, you don't really need a very deep understanding of ecology to understand that we've come to a dead end, and that proceeding down this road is suicidal. And I think that where we are now is we're in a situation where kind of deeper indigenous-based understandings of ecology and just plain old common sense are converging to say that, you know, enough is enough. It's actually survival of our civilization, if not our species, at that stake. And so where I take this is that we've now, right here in Metro Vancouver, we've got proposals to bring tar sands oil in and export it in tankers, new pipelines, massive new highways being constructed, all these things that make it dead obvious that we're heading in the wrong direction and that something really has to change. And the conception that I like to use is system change, not climate change. Because people coming from a huge variety of different ways of looking at the world know that our system is broken and that it's heading in the wrong direction, and that it has to be changed in really non-trivial ways, really basic ways. And people just intuitively know that the automobile is a big part of that. Dependence on tar sands oil is a big, massive part of that. That things like bicycles are a step in the right direction. You know, unless you're an extreme primitivist, the bicycle is the one technology that people over and over say, yeah, that's one we should hang on to. It's the one technology that makes a meal, a calorie of food that you eat actually take a human much farther than walking. Makes a human being more efficient rather than less efficient. And I think that we're actually at the point where we can talk about system change on the basis of economics, but also on the basis of what our cities are going to look like. Just on the basis of going away from this automobile-dependent system, this system dependent on fossil fuels, to one that is much more in tune with nature, just on the basis of having a reasonable carbon footprint, having a reasonable ecological footprint, not being based on consuming more and more crap every year in order to function well. And I just like to say that there's that the Occupy movement, groups like the Council of Canadians that has the systemchange.ca website and project, that I think that we're at a time where, particularly because the tar sands projects are here, we've got something very visible to get motivated to close. I think we're in a great position to make a breakthrough in movement building and actually get a capitalism and for a system change to the kind of system that that we can live with, that the planet can live with, that oysters can live with. Oh, that's good.
Thanks. It's good to see you all. I'm going to pass these around as kind of a prop. So if I don't have PowerPoint, I got to have something.
It's the new PowerPoint.
Yeah. And I'm going to leave those here. There's only 4 of them, so you can fight amongst yourselves. But what they are,
about ownership.
Yeah. What they are is an attempt to show what the region would look like if it was more sustainable. And I want to talk about sustainability for a moment. If you can't hear me, just kind of going down. But I want to talk a little bit about what sustainability is relative to this question of capitalism, and then use that as a launching pad. As you can see by my gray hair, I've been at this for quite a while. And when I was your age, I was certainly sitting in circles like this. And it's great to see the generation of circle inhabitants in this fair city and imbued with all the same passions. But at the same time, my heart goes out to you with a lot of empathy, because your situation at your age is a lot more dire, I think, than mine was. I never imagined that your generation would find yourselves in the kind of condition that you were in. Vietnam War, I'm an American, grew up in the United States, and was draftable age. Vietnam War was certainly a savage consequence of some of the phenomenon that you've been trying to talk about, a bloody one at that. But still, it didn't really constitute the level of dire threat to 7 billion people on the planet, and the vast majority of other species besides ourselves. So I think during your lifetime, sadly, you'll probably see those questions play themselves out in one way, shape, or form, or the other. And I agree with what's been said about the problems associated with the commodification of the world. Totally. It's really something that I've been clear on for a very long time, and has been a matter of passionate political belief of mine for a long time, but also a high degree of frustration at the extent to which decade after decade the same problem persists. To give you a kind of local example, or contemporary example from right now, for example, today the U.S. Supreme Court, by a very narrow margin, decided that yes, indeed, the state can decide that people shouldn't die for lack of access to the capitalist commodity health insurance in the United States. But the 4 members who voted against it said no, in fact, this is an absolute travesty, Scalia and others. This is an absolute travesty, because this basically imposes the state in a realm that they have no business in, which is basically capitalist enterprise. So even over matters of life and death, there's this huge debate over the extent to which anybody has a right to interfere with the commodification of anything in the same terms that you're talking about. So I could go on and on with that one, but it's basically all around us, so I just want to reinforce that. The only sort of point of bright light, I think, in all of this in the last 30 years has probably been the emergence of the idea of sustainability, which I think speaks to the discussions that you had earlier around ecology. And in a way is really an attempt, I think, quite clearly to, I suppose, acknowledge that capitalism is probably not going to go away, certainly not in time to save the planet. And the only thing that is remotely possible, I suppose, in this particular point of view is that if we could somehow re-engineer our thinking about all of our cultural institutions such that the issues of intergenerational responsibility are respected, so that you don't leave the place physically less capable of supporting future generations, which speaks to the questions of capitalism in its rawest form. Doesn't really care if you lose the forests or if you burn up all the coal, right? Because future conditions don't really enter into that equation. Anyway, sustainability is an attempt to basically say yes, it does. And not only that, at the same time, rather than just the commodification of everything, we really ought to put forth the proposition that the ultimate good is only ascertainable against the background of, is it working effectively in three basic realms? Economy, certainly. We all know about that, so capitalism is brought forward. But two other things are introduced, which is equity, which social democracies have really tried hard to interject within a capitalist framework. Certainly socialist states tried to make the primary reason for everything. So we have some experience with introducing the idea of social equity. The probably absolutely new thing since the 1980s is this idea of the third leg of the stool, which is the ecology. And the other thing which is quite un-capitalist, and even a significant departure from rationalist philosophies and science, is that it operates on the premise that any question that you're asking cannot be narrowed down to one variable, whether it's profit or a virus that might cause cancer. It rather has to incorporate an acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of everything, with equity, economy, and ecology representing the everything, sort of a mandala of those three things, representing the world, really. It's an attempt to say, here are the three component parts of the world. So that model is what's presented. There are other models of existence and reality, certainly, but that's the sustainability one. So I've been sort of helping myself get out of bed in the morning, which has become increasingly difficult, as the situation for us gets more and more dire, by the faint hope of this is an emerging transformational phenomenon. And while the marks of its success are not numerous as we look across the landscape, I'm also heartened by the appearance and sudden ascendance of phenomenon that were entirely unpredicted in the recent past. The Arab Spring, of course, is our most recent example. The fall of the Soviet Empire is another example. These things that were taken as very permanent and absolutely solid, irremovable realities in our world suddenly go away. So I suspect, or at least I hope, that in the future here there's a possibility for your generation and for you as individuals that you will experience such a delightful outcome, or at least a hopeful outcome. Things are not going to be great. It's not going to be all popsicles, I'm sure of that. But there is at least a hope, I think, that you'll participate and witness an important set of transformations. And the compelling thing that makes me say that is because if that actually doesn't happen, we are really looking at Armageddon, aren't we? Right? So you sort of have to expect something to happen before humankind, pushes itself over the brink to its own extinction. I mean, it seems at the species level there will be a kind of, worldwide revulsion once we get to the edge of that cliff. At least that's what I would expect to happen. Now, in terms of your present questions around what might appear against that context, the mundane issues of tankers floating by with tar sands, and a road that's going by, a road that's being built in other parts of the region to move container trucks from Powassan out to a Walmart in Calgary or wherever else they're going. I think there's also something helpful that I would connote, I would convey to you, and that's why I sent this book around to you, is that I think in this region in North America we have actually, your generation has an opportunity to do something very, very, very significant. As depressed as we might get about the lack of progress or the possibly even the few numbers that we find ourselves in the company of in this group, that doesn't take away from the fact that I'm quite sure, after thinking about these things for 40 years plus, that the Vancouver region and the people who live here have the greatest opportunity to do something very significant for, first, Canada, secondarily, North America, and thirdly, the world, for a number of reasons. Without going into great length, I'm firmly convinced that the situation here in this region, for a whole set of reasons, the situation here is far advanced from the situation in Calgary, or in Toronto, or heaven forbid, Dallas, or even Los Angeles and New York. Just in terms of the possibilities we have for charting a different path here, they are really quite great. And if we collectively, you as a group, are successful in pushing this great amoeba of this region towards a more sustainable, equitable, ecologically appropriate, and in a real way, economically realistic outcome, then you individually will have great power to influence what happens in other parts of Canada, and other parts of North America, and other parts of the world. Believe it or not, people in China, some of them anyway, are looking to Vancouver as a place where maybe we should start to do things the way they're doing it. And I think the patterns of basically post-industrial city that we have here are being looked at in ways for patterns of development and strategies for enhanced sustainability, more so than European cities even. So we're a modern city, and therefore we have lessons to give to other parts of the world, even Africa. So while that might sound highfalutin, I really think it's quite true that what we collectively and what your generation does individually and collectively can be hugely influential. Imagine yourself trying to do the stuff that we're doing if you lived in Dallas. It would be depressing in the extreme. So in my work then, to kind of bring this into conclusion and as represented there, what I've tried to do is work with people in the region and not try to diminish their enthusiasm about capitalism or whatever else it is that they're doing, but integrate that with the ideas of social equity and ecological integrity and start to work on the question, can we imagine a different model from the model that we presume is the only model that is reasonable, the model that is promoted by people like the Fraser Institute in our region and the BC Board of Trade, those folks who are very explicitly organized and very proudly organized around the idea of the profit motive as the only rationale. Can we put that against the context of our larger intergenerational responsibilities, and even in a more mundane way, situate this region to be stronger 20 years from now or 40 years from now when resource constraints around peak oil and also the difficulty of bringing food from other parts of the region really start to strike home. I and the people I've worked with have been a little bit successful in some of the things we've tried to do, and I would hope that we can be more successful. I think the questions of the Enbridge pipeline, certainly in a Canada-wide question, are quite significant. I think in terms of the regional significance, I think that the fight against the perimeter road is even more significant. The book that you're looking at shows a plan for the region where it could go from 2 million to 4 million people, but in the course of going to 4 million people would exert on a per capita basis 80% less of a drain on the planet and 80% less demands in terms of greenhouse gas production. So in conclusion, I really think that this region could, during your lifetime, be a vanguard of regional metropolitan areas that could in fact bring our lifestyles and our demands on the planet down to a level which you could anticipate could be sustained over the next 300 or 400 years. Sustained in a way that would not necessitate the melting of the polar ice caps, the rising of sea levels by 200 feet, and the likely deaths by starvation of 2 or 3 billion people in the more stressed parts of the globe. These are the stakes before us. Anyway, wow, that was kind of depressing, but I wanted to be uplifting, and I wanted to, basically the message that really we can get this thing done here in this region, and in a way that people in other regions don't have the option for. So let's, basically keep working at it. I don't know if there's time for questions or what you want to do, but
I have a question.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, the way, if I got it correctly, the way you kind of frame sustainability is working within inside a capitalist model, that would be okay. But it seems to me that, I guess, the idea of it is much more viscous than that. For instance, it seems to me that there are certain projects to be sustainable. It's not a question of how can we do it sustainably, it's just to do an X project would be unsustainable, period. And I'm thinking of the Enbridge oil pipeline, for instance. If you look at the Enbridge website, they greenwash the whole website with the idea of sustainability, right? And to me, it seems that project itself, if we're valuing what it means to be sustainable, is to say no, such a project, given at its core, is a capitalist project that entails the destruction of the environment, the whales in the region, of course the animal life, the indigenous people that require those resources. It seems to me like that the only answer to that is no. There is no how can we do it in such a way that it works.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that the whole co-option of sustainability, the word, by capitalist enterprises is problematic in the extreme. And during my life, capitalism has been capable of co-opting almost everything that comes its way. I remember, when I was 18 years old, we were all talking about revolution. It wasn't 2 years before deodorant was being sold as revolutionary. So this is a huge problem. I hope that it doesn't negate the possibility of a solution. I've become rather despondent about an alternative to capitalism, and I have to feel that under present circumstances, the only hope for us is that, as has been occasionally successful by the social democracies in Europe, for example, to mitigate the worst excesses of capitalism while not necessarily removing private enterprise from the motivation system for humans, which has, demonstrably is obviously a very successful and powerful motivational force. But I've come to feel that the only hope is for it to be dramatically mitigated, and for the frame for enterprise decisions to be thoroughly subordinated, or at least subordinated to some extent, or largely subordinated to an overarching imperative, which is that you can't kill the planet, just in the same way that capitalists now are not allowed to kill their competitors. Sort of broadening. They do it. But a broadening of the sort of moral framework for that, and of course, to bring it down to the level of the mundane, things like green taxes, taking seriously at the global scale the idea that we have to cut greenhouse gas production by 80% by 2050, which would have a market impact on Enbridge and Canada's descent into the status of petrostate, which I find very disturbing. That would cut the legs underneath that if the carbon economy had to be quickly transferred transformed as a consequence of global treaties, which people would take seriously. Unfortunately, Rio again didn't produce that, but one lives in hope. Then I think that would place the kind of Enbridge question in a different context.
What exactly, when you say of Vancouver as being kind of this model city, what exactly do you have in mind? Because to me it seems to be, we have the tankers that brought in the Enbridge oil pipelines. Vancouver is not that much of a bike-friendly city in comparison to places like Portland. It's striking to me that you frame Vancouver as being such a progressive city in that sense. So what exactly do you have in mind? Is it the potential of Vancouver?
I think that's a great question. In relative terms, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being perfectly sustainable and 1 being unsustainable, I'd probably say we're about a 2. But I think a Portland is actually a 1.8. And a Calgary is about a 1, and Toronto might be a 1.1, and Dallas is like a 0.2 or something like that. And the indicators of that are there's a number of indicators. One, we actually use transit more here than Portland by a factor of 100%. We're the only North American city that has successfully densified certainly the downtown in a very dramatic way, but even the neighborhoods that we're looking at, things like secondary suites, which are unheard of in other parts of North America, are commonplace here, which have basically doubled the amount of dwelling units throughout parts of the city that look like this. So 60% or more of our current housing production in the region is in the form of high density and therefore nominally walkable neighborhoods, because at a certain density threshold you start to have a correlation with a reduced dependence on cars, more walking, more biking, more using transit, and so forth. Our neighborhoods, albeit they're very unaffordable in terms of none of you can afford to buy that house over there, it's out of the question. But in some ways there is a higher degree of income mixing here than in other parts of North America, because you can probably afford to rent in the basement of that. Whereas other metropolitan areas in North America, they've thoroughly segregated people by income class. Square miles, just one income. So while these benchmarks are not in and of themselves dramatic, such as we don't grow and eat our own food in any kind of significant way, still we are doing better, and we are slowly doing better and better at a lot of things. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Thanks, Patrick.
You got it faster than I did. You're doing well. Yeah. Take good care. All right. All right. I'm Randy Chatterjee, and
I can't see you now, Randy. You're too tall.
I got to stand up and stretch my legs, so otherwise I'll lose them. In this town, we call it Village Vancouver. The two little birds here are the two V's of Village Vancouver. Very different from two other V's that are sometimes used in this political system in Vancouver. And I am what I call a villager. And a villager is exactly what you're describing, someone who actually can walk within his village, or his or her village, and get to what you need. Because if you grew up in a small town, and I mean a small town, not a suburb, you can walk to anything. You know everybody, and everyone says hi because you know everybody. And that's of course an idyllic world that none of us live in, and probably never have. Some villages aren't always that friendly either, so because everybody knows each other a little too much. But what the transition movement is an effort to make city life the best of what small town village life is, and also what's great about big cities, having diversity, a place for everybody, basically. An outlet for everybody, a place to live, whatever you want, you can find in a city. And there's benefits to a city, because you can find these things, and whoever you are, you can find your place. It might be a tiny little niche, but that's the wonder of nature. There's always a little niche for almost every creature, and we hope to keep those. I call myself a social permaculturist, which is, I learned from her. That's my permaculture teacher. I told her that's what I want to learn about. I don't think she knows how little I learned, but I try. Social permaculture is the part of the three principles of permaculture. There's earth care, people care, fair share. So the big three, legs of permaculture. Earth care is the ecology, and I care more about what I focused on, what I want to dedicate my life to is the people care and the fair share side. And what the transition movement is essentially looking at those positives of earth care, people care, fair share, while understanding what y'all heard before, which was, peak oil and climate change, of course, totally related to each other. You take all the oil that was created by all the plant life from 250 million years ago, when the earth was very warm enough for large dinosaurs to exist. You take all that plant form, compress it down into the ground with all the carbon in it, and all of a sudden you get a much more moderate temperature, taking all that carbon out of the atmosphere. Well, guess what? We found that oil that was left in the ground by all those plants that used to grow beautifully 250 million years ago. We've stuck it back in the air, so we're getting back the exact same environment that the dinosaurs loved 250 million years ago and thrived in. Well, we're not dinosaurs. I don't think we should become dinosaurs, which we are. And so the idea of peak oil or peak everything, in fact, and climate change are related. Those are two sort of things we're trying to run away from. The other is economic instability, the debt basis of capitalism. All money is created in capitalism by debt. All of it. Right? You can't have money without some debt account associated with it. Every mortgage is debt. Every college degree is debt. You name it. You got debt everywhere. And debt means a Ponzi scheme, because if you have debt, you got to pay it off. And guess what? You got to pay off more than you borrowed. So where's that more come from? Growth. You've got to grow. You've got to get bigger. You got to take more. You got to grab that water because you can't pay your debt back otherwise. And that's by definition a Ponzi scheme. And so what transition looks at is, okay, we got a system that's fucked. I mean, it's broken. We're not going to mitigate capitalism. It can't be mitigated. Try to imagine an irresistible force and an immovable object, right? What happens when they come together? All right, so the immovable object, I think, is capitalism. And we are the irresistible force. Humans are. It's sad. It's actually a bad thing in many ways. But try to imagine we're not people, but we're a river. What happens when we hit that irresistible force? We don't try to go through it. Rivers wind. When they hit big mountains, they go around. So the game of transition is to say, look, we can play in this system, but we're just going to be beating our heads against the wall for a long time. Or we can just take a sharp right turn. And so transition is basically saying, we can make that turn, and if enough of us go together in that turn, we can make some real changes. And the sort of the nuts and bolts on the ground, we can start, instead of monetizing everything, using money for everything, we can start sharing. People have done that for a million years. We all do. We share a bicycle, share a meal with somebody, have a potluck, share food. We all know how to do that, but it's such a tiny part of our economy that it's just not how we think anymore. If you don't have money, you have nothing. Well, what if you have a neighbor who you actually talk to? What a concept. And they own a canoe. You want to go canoeing? Well, you could ask to borrow the canoe, and at the same time maybe say, look, she charged some blackberries. Could I offer you some blackberries? No money changes hands. There's no debt associated with this relationship anymore. That's a kind of a cool concept. Another one that I built a year and a half ago, a box out of leftover chunks of wood that I'm rebuilding a house, and built a box, and I started throwing some seeds in there. Leftover seed packets that people would buy, tomatoes, right? And there's 300 tomato seeds in this little packet for $3.99 from West Coast Seeds. Well, they're only going to grow 10 of them, right? So what do they do with the other 290 seeds? Well, they go bad in a year or two. I mean, they're not going to survive. But what if they shared them? Well, how do you do that? Well, we have wonderful things where things like this exist called libraries. Library is a cool thing, right? You can get any book. You can get Patrick's book. I'm sure there's 20 copies of this at the VPL. And needless to say, there's 4 of them here. I bet all of us could read this book many times over, 4 among the 20 or so of us. So, you know, it doesn't take that long to read. Do you really need to have this at your house forever? Read it and pass it on. Libraries are great. I created a seed library. And the world used to have seed libraries. Every farmer saved seeds. And when some other farmer lost their seeds or started a new farm or wanted to try something different, they borrowed seeds from the neighboring farmer. Well, guess who you get seeds from now? Yeah, it's Monsanto, Syngenta. And you got to pay for them. You got to spend money. And of course, you don't have money, so you've got to get a loan from a bank to go get some seeds from Monsanto because they're expensive. And you pay back that debt plus a little bit of money at the end of the planting season when hopefully your produce comes out and you get a little bit of a profit out of that. That's a system that's doomed to fail because you'll never have enough money. And the whole history of agriculture is a history of boom and bust, of farmers losing everything. And it happens all the time. It wasn't just the 1930s, it's happening today. Farmers don't make it. It's brutal and they lose everything they've spent to buy their land, which wasn't ours to begin with. They belong to the First Nations, all of the land, or to Mother Nature, however you want to look at it. So we have a system that's just impossible. An individual can't do much about it. You can go off grid, you can go live in the wilderness and you know, hunt without a weapon, hunt for what you need. You're not going to have a whole lot of impact, but if a lot of people get together, as I think Occupy proved, a lot of people get together, you begin to have impact, and you can support each other. And someone who's really good at making a bow and arrow, along with somebody who's really good at growing food, can work together. And what transition is finding someone who can build a seed library, with someone who knows how to build a greenhouse, with someone who really knows how to build soil. And you get together and you share these ideas and share the experience. And if you start farming, you better darn well have some friends who've been in farming. It's hard to figure out everything. It's a very tough career, but there's a lot of people doing it now. I mean, it's a really powerful thing. And so what transition is in the city, we're into not just community gardens where everyone has their own little plot, you know, this is mine, this is my 10 square feet or 100 square feet, where everybody farms the same area together. Okay, you get to water on Mondays and you get to do weeding on Tuesdays, and well, if you can't come out on Tuesday, well, this person will fill in. You work on things together, collaborative gardening. That needs to happen to grow anything of any quantity or quality or effectiveness in terms of growing food for ourselves. So we do collaborative gardening here. We've got a number of different projects where we're starting collaborative gardens in the city. So something where a group of people get together. An example of this might be, although it's a slightly different model, Soul Food downtown. Lots of volunteers. It's a community building organization really in the downtown east side to grow significant amounts of food, to feed a significant amount of people. And it's good food. It's non-commoditized. There's no debt associated with Soul Food. And I mean, it's a wonderful model that we should be doing much more. And yes, some of the food could be sold to just buy more, you know, inputs or something like that. But generally, the principle of fair share is everybody gets what they need. And that's really, really important. And that's a big part of people care. So while I might go to a farmer's market and buy some extra things that Soul Food has and pay money for it, Soul Food might give away some of their extra produce to someone who really needs to feed themselves. And that's the kind of model, the sharing model, the sharing economy that we stress. Our seed library, of course, is free. The beautiful thing about it is you take seeds, we don't want them back. Except once you figure out how to save seeds from what you grow, we want those back. Because the cool thing about a seed library is you borrow a book, you don't read it, you give it back to the library, right? That's a book that no one wants to read because no one's reading it. They borrow it, they take it back. The seeds we get back in the seed library are the seeds that grew well here because their parents grew well. And the seed library, to the degree it becomes funded by the next generation of seeds, then becomes a seed library of things that we like and that grow well here. And that's pretty powerful. And so that's kind of the model of transition that we hope to pursue. Aside from that seed library, we have potlucks to share all these things. We have everything from, well, relating to seeds a little bit, we've spawned community currency. We have a project called Seed Stock, which started in Village Vancouver. It's morphed because it's gotten a little bit bigger, but we're actually creating our own currency, non-debt-based currency, where people can use money essentially as a barter system, as a way of exchanging things, as a way of sharing, rather than as a way of being in debt and I need more of this. Seed Stock has no constraints. We can make as much of it as people need to share with. Anyway, Seed Stock, check it out. It's coming out this summer. We're going to actually print bills, believe it or not, and they're going to be exchangeable, just like Canadian currency. But the wonderful thing about it is, currency is kind of like blood. It flows around. It brings things. You use it to go get some oxygen, bring it to your muscles, right, or your brain cells. Currency is basically like the blood of the human economy. All right, what happens to the human economy when we buy a lot of cars from, or a lot of plastic toys from China? Well, the money goes out. The blood flows out. Well, guess what happens? We're bleeding, and it's a problem. It's the global capitalist system. The great thing about Seed Stock is the Chinese don't want it. They can't buy anything with it over there, and so it stays in the community. It's blood that's actually contained within our system. And again, that's a permaculture concept of making sure you've got a contained, bounded system that is self-reinforcing, that circulates around, and it's very, very important. And what transition does, I think, importantly, is to look at, and what Village Vancouver tries to do is look at everybody as just a way to feed this sort of system that circulates around internally. And whether it's lots of potlucks or sharing things, recycle, we can do it. It's just that we've got this other program called capitalism that tells us, oh, there's another way. You've got to move faster. You've got to go into debt, essentially. And I don't think you do. I don't think anybody has to. And again, it depends on all of us working together. A really interesting problem we have is this Saturday, we've got a really neat community festival, Festival of the Sun, Carnival de Sol downtown. It's on Granville Street. They had a little piece of it last Saturday. It's last Sunday, but on Saturday there's the Carnival del Sol, which is a great Hispanic street festival. They're closing the streets. There's going to be soccer games on the street. Lots of fun things going on. There's also the March for Peace. Starts at Kitsilano, marches around to the West End. That starts at noon. And these are both important movements. One sort of a social, cultural movement, one a peace movement. And then also, down in Surrey, there's the Occupy South Fraser Perimeter Road. Well, the wonderful thing is, we can do all three. And this is what we need to do. We need, as a community, to be aware that, okay, in the morning, if we want to have fun and really enjoy an inner city cultural experience, the Carnival del Sol, there's an important global issue about peace and the importance of peace. There's a movement for that, but also we've got a local, very important local initiative that you can, if you walk downtown, hop on the SkyTrain, go out to Scott Road, and meet out there. And there's a walk to Occupy for the taking back and reclaiming our agricultural lands and restraining our desire to transport everything everywhere, which is what the South Fraser Perimeter Road is all about, and building, of course, lots of new housing on that land. And that highway is just a highway to more development on agricultural land. That's all it is. Yeah, they might be moving a few trucks on it, but there's way too many stop signs and stoplights on that road to be for just trucks. That's just more development. We know that. And that's not going to help us. It's not going to get us anywhere other than off a cliff. And I don't want to see that happen. So we have this great opportunity if we recognize there's many different forces, many different people. There's probably going to be 10,000 people walking in the March for Peace. In a perfect world, they march to the SkyTrain, they go to Scott Road. And then Eric's got a great big crowd of people to help deliver a very, very important message to the province. What we need to think about is connecting all these different things and really operating as if we don't have boundaries between ourselves. Again, that's what capitalism tries to do. Define what's yours, what's somebody else's, to create this odd concept that I think it was Ralph Waldo Emerson said, good fences make good neighbors. Fences are a problem. Fences define boundaries and ownership and things like that. We don't need fences. We need to be peaceniks who go to care about road building or supporting not road building. We need to be partying on Granville Street with an amazing Hispanic festival and go to these things. We need to be doing all these things together and having fun. And I think it's really important that we, transition's all about finding different people and just finding what their interests are and making it all happen and bringing people together to do that. And again, whether it's potlucks or whether it's natural building, putting solar panels on your house and doing that in a week. You need to have a community to figure out how to do it. I don't know how panels work. I kind of stick a little multimeter in to see how much voltage I got off of it at a community festival. I don't know what that means. It's not my thing. But there's a Vancouver Renewable Energy Co-op that I didn't know existed. They'll help me do that. That's their job. And there's a lot of people here doing a lot of really important things. And the more we know what each other are doing and support each other, we can go around this immovable object called capitalism. Just go a different way. And when enough of us go the other different way, who cares what the capitalists are doing? They're going to be dead. They're not going to have any. They're not going to have any new whatever customers, whatever they're looking for. And I think that's the game. If we can just stop as much as we can. Not that easy. Stop spending money. Just ignore the money part. Try to find a way to borrow the book. Don't buy it. Go to the library. Library cards are great. I've got 2 library cards in my wallet, and I'm running out of time. But the 2 best library cards in the world, of course, are, first of all, this one. We all know what that one looks like. That's to get books. This one's to get tools. If you want to build anything, that's the tool library. And it's free. Well, it's not totally free, but close. We're trying to make it free. But anyway, those are the important things we need to do, and transition's all about making those kind of relationships happen. So if you want to borrow an axe, which I did last week, to split some logs, that a neighbor of mine cut down a tree and left the tree there for me to take because they didn't want it. That's what you do. Borrow a hatchet, you don't buy one. And it was free. But anyway, that's transition. That's Village Vancouver. Join us when you want. If you want to do something, anybody can put an event on our site to bring more people to it.
Thanks, Randy.
Okay.